It looks like it's time to begin. And so I want to welcome everyone to our next panel. The title of the paper is Risking Ourselves, the Politics and Persons of Risk. My name is Joseph Stramondo, and I am an assistant professor of philosophy at San Diego State University, as well as serving as the associate director of the university's Institute of Ethics and Public Affairs. And our speaker today is Dr. Melinda Hall. She holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University in philosophy, and she is associate professor and chair of philosophy at Stetson University. She is also director of the Gender Studies program and co-director of the Community Education Project, Stetson's higher education in prisons program. She specializes in bioethics, continental philosophy, and the philosophy of disability. Hall is the author of the book, The Bioethics of Enhancement, Transhumanism, Disability, and Bioethics, or Biopolitics, sorry, which was put out by Lexington Books in 2016. A very good read, if I do say so. Her current book project is centering on the ethics and politics of risk, which I'm guessing might be related to the talk you're giving today, judging from the title. Hall is also the author of articles published in journals like Disability Studies Quarterly, International Journal of Feminist Approaches to Bioethics, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and Philosophy Compass, among other venues. And in her very little free time, I would imagine, she is also glad to support Shelley Tremaine as co-editor over at Biopolitical Philosophy. And I just want to say on a personal note, I've known Melinda since we were in graduate school, and reading her bio makes me both very excited and proud of her for her career now at this point, and it also makes me feel very old that she's the that she's the chair of philosophy at Stetson. But congratulations to Linda, and I will hand it over to her now.
Thank you so much, Joe. And yes, I actually well remember, I was thinking about the first time we met. I believe it was at the Peanut Barrel in Lansing, Michigan. So it's always nice to see you, Joe, and thank you for that really kind introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and begin sharing my screen, and I am going to talk through my work here. Let me see if this is going slowly. I'm going to be talking through my work here. I don't want to read my paper. I'd rather work through the ideas with all of you. And I would say that it is my want to speak too quickly, so I will try not to do that in this case. So if I do speak too quickly, if somebody could indicate to me that that is happening, then I can sort of stop doing that. Okay. So, as Joe mentioned, this talk is obviously connected to my book project, and this book project has been on my mind and in my on my desk for quite a while now. And one of the biggest and most surprising interruptions to this book project is COVID, and so I'll definitely be addressing that and thinking through that as well. So I describe my work under the rubric of philosophy of disability. This is informed by critical disability theory, which is interdisciplinary. And the task of this sort of work is to analyze disability as cultural, as historical, as relative, social, and political. And what we're always going to be trying to do within critical disability theory, or at least what I'm often trying to do, is push back against naturalization and medicalization. So the work of critical disability theory always involves, or often involves, scrutinizing not bodily or mental impairments, but the social norms that define particular attributes as impairments. And this is from a quote from work by Sammy Schalk, which I really appreciate. And what is disability on this sort of perspective? Overall, disability is not natural. It's systematically produced institutionally and discursively. Further, I follow Shelley's conception that impairment too is socially constructed. She argued back in 2001 that this was socially constructed. She situates it as a naturalized precursor of disability and part of a larger historically relative political apparatus, which she reiterated in her recent monograph published in 2017. What does this not mean? It does not mean that disability and impairment are not real. The idea that these things are socially constructed, are politically relative, speaks just as much to their materiality, their measurability, their reality, as a more sort of medicalized view might speak. We just have fundamentally reframed how to understand disability, what's important about it, and to what it points. So to be specific about what my work looks like then, I investigate sites or contexts of disabilities construction, largely trying to reject the false choice of either the built environment or embodiment as the primary explanatory mechanism. I want to resist homogenization and naturalization, as I spoke to earlier. The point about homogenization is that I do not want to create a monolith in my work of what counts as disability. It needs to be variegated. It needs to be responsive to the variety of intersecting identities that are involved. So overall, I read disability as a way to track who has power, who can speak truth, and how our world is organized. And to speak to the theme of this conference, philosophy and social change, I wanted to iterate the fact that my work and the kind of work I strive to do, because it involves a scrutiny of normative ideologies, in the words of Julie Minnick, it shouldn't occur just for its own sake, for knowledge production on its own, but with the goal of producing knowledge, she writes, in support of justice for people with stigmatized bodies and minds. Again, that latter phrase is a quote from Minnick's work in 2016. So philosophers of disability, I argue, should work in solidarity for the purposes of liberation with people who are devalued or pathologized, but as Minnick points out, may not always be labeled or self-identified as disabled. This cuts across a variety of different marginalized groups. So with all of that said, my sort of research overview, sharing with you, letting you in on my work, I'd like to begin talking about the main subject of my talk today, which is risk. And I find risk absolutely fascinating. I've been working on it since sort of the Ebola outbreak in 2015, 2016, actually as far back, I think, as December 2014. And this has just been a source of endless philosophical fascination for me. So my current book project does focus on risk. What I'm trying to do is figure out how risk is constructed and how it intersects with, overlaps with disability, impairment, and these other structures and ideas that I want to investigate. I'm also interested, perhaps most importantly, in the distribution of and attribution of responsibility for risk in bioethics and public health contexts. What I'd like to do with this book is reframe ethical issues presented by dominant understandings of risk. And this, consider the fact that most of the time, if people talk about the ethics of risk communication, they usually sort of say that lay people don't understand risk, that they have to be helped to understand risk. And that's really the main ethical issue, is how to be clear in the communication of risk, especially to those who don't have that sort of base understanding of what it means to change your behavior. And I just reject this as the primary problem connected to risk. And I'd like to reframe. I'd like to uncover how individuals and populations are positioned discursively. specifically as at risk or as risky subjects or doing risky behaviors. And I want to sort of collectivize the ways that we're asked to manage risk. I want to push back against the individualization of responsibility for risk. And of course, this is familiar to those with interest in sociology and with interest in Foucault as the concept of responsibilization. So I'm now sharing an image of the COVID-19 virus. It's gray, it's on a gray background, and it has red sort of appendages, pustules. I'm no viral expert, so I'm not sure what they're called, but I have this image up because I want to indicate to you that, as I sort of mentioned earlier, in the center of my work, or at the beginning, I suppose, in some ways, all of a sudden we had this major issue that turned everyone's attention toward risk. This makes my job in my book both harder and more important. I do believe that the perspective that I have in my book is borne out by what has been happening with COVID. And I am very excited to continue this work now with a sort of very important example of how attribution for risk, responsibility for risk gets done. So what is that main argument that I think is copacetic with COVID discussions? That is that risk management discourses tend to marginalize those affected by them and paradoxically increase the harms to which some are subject. Now, I'm not going to say increase the risks to which some are subject, although I'm often tempted to do that. Because I don't want to reiterate or reinscribe or reify what risk is. I think that risk is political all the way down, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And the reason why, and I have my primary argument in bold on my slide right now, and that's what I just read out, risk management discourses tend to marginalize those affected and paradoxically increase the harms to which some are subject. Part of the reason for why this happens is that responsibilization. And what I'm going to do to uncover that is use Foucault to demonstrate that feature and others of risk discourses. So that's the critical side of my project. The positive side of my project is that I argue that responsibility for risk, especially health risks, and maybe the especially just comes from my particular interests and my desire to work in this area, should be collectively shared. So we have to, in order to do this, in order to share responsibility for risk, we have to read risk politically. And the language of risk that we have currently, the discourse of risk, has to be interrupted. So I'm going to make a couple recommendations as to how we might risk ourselves together by the end of this talk. I've done a version of this talk very recently that is quite a bit longer. So I have other things to say, but I want to be very mindful of my time. So there may be some things that I want to address during Q&A or might get the opportunity to address there. So what is risk? You won't be surprised that the way that I approach risk is very similar to the way that I approach disability and impairment. Risk is most familiar, though, to us in the guise of risk assessment. In some discursive settings, risk and risk assessment are used actually synonymously. So Golding and Tuller note this, right? And what that means is that there's no sort of concept of risk as such. There's risk assessment, which tells us what to pay attention to when we talk about risk, but there's no sort of nugget of materiality or conceptual sort of certainty that is risk. So we have a lot of areas in which risk assessment occurs. These are sort of everywhere, and this list is in no way exhaustive. But up on my screen, I have a few different arenas in which we would be very familiar with risk assessment: construction, information technology, public health, property loss and damage, environmental protection. And I've just read this really cool piece and taught it actually by Obasogi, who wants us to sort of analogize risk assessments done by and through the EPA, he's asking to do this with regard to racialized medicine. So where you would do race impact assessments for new medicines. And I think this is really interesting. It's something I'm gonna try to look into further for my project. There's also risk assessment happening in large scale conflicts and disruptions. And a lot of this literature that I've been looking at and engaging is coming from sociology, which is a relatively new arena for me. But what do we get out of all of this? Most of the time, what we have is risk as a technocratic science. So risk assessment is a technocratic concern, and what this gives rise to is a sort of whole arena of professional workers and a whole arena of professions. Specifically, you might get the certification of risk managers. That can happen in construction. Again, that could happen in other arenas. And as a technocratic science, risk assessment discourse is going to double down on what I've already denied, which is that there's some kind of nugget that is risk or that risk points to. Risk assessment is going to sort of assume objective risk measures, or at least stable ones, and acceptable levels of risk. It's going to inscribe acceptable levels of risk. So an example theorization in public health might equate risk to a sort of complex calculation: the multiplication of emissions, transport, loss factor, exposure period, uptake, and toxicity factor. And you might think that sociology has a lot to say about this, and indeed that's right. Way back in 1982, Mary Douglas and Aaron Wladulski sort of argued that worries over risks are always cultural and they're not objective. In other words, there might be sort of value disputes over what counts as a risk that sharpens a divide between the scientist or the risk professional and the layperson. And so what that means is sociologists are trying to urge that what is presented in those conflicts is different lifestyles, different things that are important to folks. So somebody might say, well, I'm going to take this risk, but I don't even see it as a risk. This is just something that's of value to me. So they focus on the sort of culturally dependent nature of risk interpretation. And so you get different sort of clusters in sociology literature. Kahan and co-authors talk about the egalitarian sort of method of thinking about risk, individualistic methods, and hierarchical ones. And meanwhile, risk as I've already sort of started to indicate, in bioethics and public health, sort of frame that sort of discourse frames health as personal risk management. This has implications, right, for audiences of risk communication. So what you're being told sort of against this larger backdrop of risk assessment, cultural values, and things like that, is that you are responsible for your own risk factors, for your own risk management. So this has implications both for your understanding of yourself, your understanding of others, and your understanding of the role of medicine. So what do I want to do here? I want to push back. There are many alternative portraits of risk, and learning what risk really is, and by really I mean how it sort of appears and who is responsible for it, is going to require investigating the many sites of stories that we tell about risk. I don't think we should privilege the understanding of risk in risk assessment sciences. And given the fact that current practices in medicine and public health tend to increase harms rather than decrease them, I believe we should also be suspicious of health as risk management. That's sort of my starting point. And I worry about going long, so I'm going to try to be quick here. So this is where I could really go into depth, but I'm sort of not doing that today. I have in this planned book project, I've been working on these different sites of risk construction, really case studies that I am engaging. And I'll just say one or two things about these. In terms of police brutality, I'm very interested in the example of Darren Wilson's testimony in the case of his shooting of Michael Brown, in which he articulated that he could not attest to the fact that Michael Brown wasn't armed or wasn't carrying a weapon insofar as his body constituted that weapon. So you get these sort of very odd moments in which risk assessments imbue danger into a particular subject. Similarly, George Zimmerman, here I'm in Central Florida, 15 minutes away, George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin. And he said that they were on a sidewalk. He said that Trayvon Martin was essentially armed because he could have thrown George Zimmerman onto the sidewalk. And so what that means is, again, in cases of sort of brutality and engagements in which folks are doing these sort of supposedly split-second risk assessments, what they're doing is they are attributing certain individuals with danger or with risk. We have gun violence and school shootings in which people are trying to figure out, how do we handle this risk? You get the hardening of schools, which I'm going to argue is a bad sort of move. In direct-to-consumer testing and choosing children, you get the idea that you're responsible for your health in deeper and ever new ways. You're sort of a pre-vivor, a patient in waiting, to use the language offered by Joseph Dumet. And finally, in viral illness, this is really where I started with this project. With regard to Ebola and Zika, you get the construction of what the risk is, what it means, the racialized body, the potentially disabled child, the infant with microcephaly. You get the sense that, well, you shouldn't allow yourself to be bitten by a mosquito, because then you might cause disability in a future child. So what do we find at these sites overall? Risk is constructed or political all the way down, is my argument. Risk is not an inert description. It's a floating signifier. For this, I'm pulling from Ernest Laclau that can attach to people and populations. There's no sort of stable rope linking the signified and the signifier. And most importantly, risk landscapes can be otherwise. We can do something different. So somebody might ask, well, okay, this actually seems a sort of trivial point. Is the point that you make that risk is constructed or political all the way down merely sort of a redescription of what risk assessment science is? In other words, isn't risk calculated in precisely these ways that I've been talking about? That is, or for example, it's already considered shifting and deeply circumstantial. Well, sure. But I respond here that technocratic risk assessment holds the wrong factors in abeyance. It is holding as neutral this discursive and institutional. It's holding as variable individual behavior. So what's shifting and deeply circumstantial on my account is not individual behavior ignorance, but it's shared and political features, institutions, discourses, political decision-making, material conditions. So on my screen now is an image of my favorite philosopher in the world, Michel Foucault. It's a color image, and he's looking down into the side, wearing his signature glasses. And I have listed his sort of three features of his moral perspective, which are refusal of the status quo, creativity, and innovation, which he spoke about in a 1980 interview with Michael Bess, which I always reference because this is just very helpful for me. What I want to do is refuse the status quo with regard to risk assessment, be creative in thinking about sharing and collectivizing risk, and innovate, that is, create political projects around risk. These are my sort of primary analytical claims in the book. And I, again, need to be mindful of time. So I'll try to keep this really sort of brief or at least concise. Risk management discourses, again, what I'm saying is that they marginalize those effective. affected and increase the severity of the harms to which they're subject. So my example here, to keep this concise, is with the hardening of schools. Somebody says we have to protect our school districts from potential school shooters. There's incredible risk here. And the risk is that somebody will come in and with a weapon and kill folks who are on site. And so what happens? Well, you get this sort of deep hardening of schools post-Columbine here in the US. And hardening is when you have on site police officers and other officials representing various sort of law organizations and fences and metal detectors and all of these things. What we see here is just the deepening, the explosion of the school to prison pipeline. What you do in the name of protecting children is send them to prison, is my argument. So what you get is a marginalization of the very persons you want to protect in the name of risk management. I'm also claiming that risk subjectifies. You get all kinds of different figures with regard to risk. You have the at-risk population now in schools, to follow my, my example from before. You get the venture capitalist on the very other end of the spectrum. I mean, I am just so fascinated by the fact that some folks are celebrated for taking risks and some are castigated. And the primary thing that I want to focus on today to kind of begin to end this conversation, or to get closer to the sort of upshot of my presentation, is that risk discourses are productive failures. And Dan Taylor helped me with this concept a few years ago at a conference. I believe it was at CSWIP, to remind me of the importance of this for Foucault, and I've sort of dug back into it. And the idea here is that risk management discourses don't reduce harms for people, but they do something else. And this is like the idea of a productive failure is when you don't get the purported result, but you get something else, and that something else is convenient. And the something else that's convenient here is the individualization of responsibility. It's convenient for neoliberalism. It's convenient for capitalism. I'm talking too quickly. I'll slow down. It is the concept of responsibilization. That is the making responsible of individuals for risk, for choice, for their life, the material circumstances of their life. And you can see that in Foucault's History of Sexuality, published in English in 1990. Catherine Mills picks up on this in a book chapter in 2016 in an edited collection by Wilmer that is quite good on resisting biopolitics. So what is a responsibilized COVID-19 project? So again, this is trying to get us to the upshot of my project for today. I really want to focus for a moment on COVID. The responsibilized projects are stay at home, wash your hands, social distance, wear a mask. It will be no surprise to anyone in this conversation, I don't think today, that you can't do these things unless you're positioned to. The same folks who are being pushed to do these things also have to survive. So they leave the house for work, or they're crammed together in close living quarters that are not safe or not well ventilated. And so you get these claims: love your neighbor, wear a face mask. I mentioned earlier Zika, and I always use this example. Again, I'm here in Florida. I've used this example since I started on this project a number of years ago. When the Zika virus was in outbreak, I saw in my building a poster that said, don't let yourself get bitten by mosquitoes. And it had a woman in like long sleeves with a spray can of bug spray and things like that. And I just thought, I can't not be bitten by a mosquito. I live in Central Florida. I have lizards in my office. I have, it's Florida. It's alive here. And so the idea that that I had with respect to that, which is just one small part of my overall project, is you can directly trace what needs to happen here in Florida, and it's not to do with me wearing long sleeves, and that is we need better wetlands management here, right? Because our wetlands management lack thereof, creates the situation in which mosquito populations explode, and they are the viral vectors for the Zika virus. So in much the same way, I'm looking at this, and I have on my screen right now an image, and it says, love your neighbor, wear a face mask. There are 3 people all wearing masks featured here. It's a cartoon. It's from a campaign by the Wisconsin Council of Churches. And it reminds me of the Zika poster because it looks like it's my job to ensure the reduction of the spread of COVID. But I can wear a face mask and still be in danger because of social and political decision making. So I want to talk about collectivized COVID-19 projects, and then I'll sort of wrap up. On this slide, I have an image of 2 hands. They're drawn, and they're holding each other, and they're in black, and it says underneath in stylized text, "We need each other." And so, what's a collectivized COVID-19 project? Mutual aid, decarceration. That is letting people out who are waiting on parole, getting people out who are not yet charged, decarceration and general abolition, universal basic income. How can I stay at home? Got to have the ability to keep the lights on. Debt relief, online remote work and learning. These all come with their own risks. And I want to talk about that in a minute, just as I finish. On my screen now is a sort of screenshot from a website done by the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief Group, which is a national grassroots effort. And it says collective care is our best weapon against COVID-19 and other disasters. There's a lot of text there, and you can visit the website mutualaiddisasterrelief.org to read it. It says that our individual responses of stockpiling, isolating, and caring for yourself are not sufficient. We have to ground ourselves in an ethics and practice of social solidarity. And I just want to end with one warning, and I actually do have one more slide here. I keep saying I'm going to end. I have a warning or a concern coming from the idea of nudging, or what Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein call choice architecture. In 2008, they argued that we should sort of, as public policy, create circumstances in which people are nudged to do things in their best interest, because most folks don't, because we don't understand risk properly. I object to this in a variety of ways, and I'm happy to talk about that more during Q&A. But essentially, this is sort of a neoliberal strategy, and I want to use Catherine Mills to say, hey, this is an apparatus of choice. That means that we have material and discursive elements shaping but not determining practice in a given context. This is sort of a literal, the choice architecture idea is a literal working out of the apparatus of choice. And so why do I call this a warning? Well, whatever collective responsibility for risk looks like, it can't be this sort of neoliberal choice architecture that Thaler and Cass Sunstein talked about. I think we need strong models of collective responsibility. I think that we should reconceive risk engagement as a collective project. Indeed, we can read these things as risky, even while saying that risk is political and constructed. And so I want to ask everyone to risk ourselves together. And that is actually where I'll stop. And I don't know if I can sort of stop sharing, or if I have. Hopefully I have.
Wonderful. Thank you for the terrific talk, Melinda. I learned a lot. I'm sure others have too. Okay, so we do have some questions in the queue here. The first one is from Shelley Tremaine, and she asks, near the outset, you said that risk is politically constructed all the way down. I agree with this. I find myself repeatedly confronted by and disagreeing, usually silently, with disabled activists who say that they are high risk. Fair enough. I think their claims naturalize both risk and disability. Why do you think that disabled people, including activists and theorists, who argue for social construction of disability, seem to revert to this particular way of naturalizing disability and risk?
Thank you so much. That's such a fantastic question, Shelley. And I think that I really just deeply resonate with it. And I will say, I don't have what I think is like an amazing answer here, but it does remind me of what I've been thinking of sort of I want to say partially, or I need to work this out, but I've been thinking about this as a sort of strategic essentialism that people fall into. And it's very sort of politically inconvenient or hard or problematic. And I see it in when people seek out diagnoses to get care. I think it's the same sort of move. What does it mean when somebody says, hey, I'm high risk for this? They're asking for something. They're asking for a shift in the way that we do things and the way that we've organized the world around us because they have a need. What does that mean? Well, the need itself can be described and redescribed in a variety of ways. And of course, I'm going to lean toward the social and the political, right? This isn't to sort of refuse the idea that people have a body, and in fact they do. And as I've tried to say from the outset, right, of course disability and impairment are real, even as I'm describing them as constructed. That doesn't mean they're not real. But I do think that the worry here is that when you insist that you're high risk, you buy into these claims that, well, there are some that are sort of disabled and some that are super disabled, and right, this sort of like hierarchical set of claims that can be really deleterious to politically progressive projects. But we do that, I think, because of the limitations of our current discursive situation. We know how we have to get the care or the things we need. And that's to use this language. I think it is not good. So I like that question a lot. And I wish I had like something richer to say here, but I do see it as continuous with like seeking diagnosis to get an accommodation, for example.
So we have a second question, which is a follow-up here from Cynthia Stark. Thank you for your timely talk. I'm wondering if your claim that risk is political all the way down leaves room for a distinction between actual risk and perception of risk. I'm thinking of your example of white cops believing themselves to be high risk when confronting Black men. Or if you wish to move yeah, so there's that question about perception versus actual risk.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I'm really struggling with this. And this is actually like sort of what's behind one of my initial comments, that I want to avoid saying something like paradoxically risk is increased through risk discourse, and shifting to like this idea that paradoxically harm is increased through risk discourse, because I don't want to reiterate it. It's related to that. And let me see if I can say something that's more direct. So I do think we can have bad interpretations. We can have bad interpretations of social and political circumstances. We have better and worse sort of insights into the world around us. And I do also think that who believes themselves to be vulnerable is highly politicized right now in really sort of along racialized terms, along gendered terms, things like that. And of course, disability too. So in terms of real risk, it might be really tempting to say something like, well, Trayvon Martin was the one who was really at risk when he encountered George Zimmerman on the street. And George Zimmerman thought he was in trouble, but he was in a truck and he chased him down. And then he jumped out and attacked him. And so the risk was actually reversed. He was quite wrong about it or something. I guess I just want to for now resist saying that like Trayvon was at risk in that moment, like that it was like very, that's the word we should use. Maybe we could say like open to injury, or talk about like the ways in which our our racialized landscape in the U.S. in Central Florida, in this gated community 15 minutes from my home, that sort of creates a situation in which some are open to injury and some are not. I am not open to injury in this space, right? So what does that mean? I mean, maybe it's a distinction without a difference. I'm still working on this, right? I just don't want to say for now that it's risk, that it's actually like something called risk.
Cool. Okay. So our next question is from Benjamin Carpenter. And he says, this has been a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I wonder if we could understand your line of argument or your line of explanation alongside a deep criticism of the notion of individuality, often at work within contemporary political discourse. I'm thinking here about how some people in the UK and probably elsewhere have often made the claim that they are, quote, happy to take the risk, end quote, of defying social distancing policies and instructions, as if that risk is theirs and theirs alone. This seems to reveal that an individualistic way of thinking about subjectivity and agency just isn't enough. I would love to hear any thoughts about this connection to health as a kind of public good.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I mean, I think that you're precisely correct that this is sort of a very farcical way of talking about risk. It's like this way that's available to some people, and actually, it's not even really available to them, right? They might say like, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and move forward, and I guess in one way it's available when people say, well, I don't care if I get COVID, and they have it even on their deathbed or something like that. They're saying, I don't care if I get it. But I guess I want to say here that, yeah, we like to talk about people's tolerance for risk now that COVID has sort of like, changed the way we talk about risk. In other words, somebody might say, well, I have a higher tolerance for risk than you, so I don't mind. I'm going to go on I'm going to go on the trip, or I'm going to go to work. I guess I just have a higher tolerance to risk than you. But we don't have those sort of personal relationships to COVID. We have a collective relationship to COVID. And you can see that in the example, sort of now famous, of the Maine wedding, in which nobody who was at the wedding died of COVID. But after the wedding occurred and it was small, I think something like, were there 55 people at the wedding and then 12 others died? Or was it more than that and then 55 people died? Something like that. But nobody who died was actually at the wedding, but they did die of COVID because of that wedding. And so I just think that we don't have personal relationships to risk with regard to COVID. And people talk like that. I think what they mean is something like, I don't have to care about this. And the reason they don't have to care about it could be like a moral failure, an imaginative failure, or something like that. And it's just something I have to like keep working on.
Great. Okay. Um, so our next question comes from Avram Hiller. They ask, Dr. Hall, thanks for the great presentation. I like very much and appreciate your critical approach to risk. Often in the literature, quantitative risk assessment is contrasted with an invocation of the precautionary principle. The examples that you give with school shootings and COVID risks seem to be more like a criticism of the precautionary principle that we must protect our children and neighbors no matter what, regardless of other potential harms, which is what a lot of risk assessment models also try to assess, although agree that they don't always succeed in doing so. So I wonder if at least some of your criticisms can also be used against the very precautionary models that standard risk assessment models are intended to supplant.
That's really interesting. I wish I had an answer for that. I need to think more about the precautionary principle as a sort of replacement. I think that what the just briefly, it seems to me that the precautionary principle is continuous with risk assessment because it's still dealing with sort of contingency and chance. Back in 1992, Ulrich Beck, again in the sociology literature, right, suggested that we live in this risk society. That the reason that it's sort of a postmodern formation in which we take contingency and chance to be central features of our lives together, and that this risk assessment stuff is what we're doing in response to this idea that a central feature is chance and contingency. And maybe the precautionary principle is like sort of attempt at like a sophisticated philosophical stance with regard to contingency and chance. But it's also sort of status quo preserving. So when I've taught precautionary principles, principle-based arguments in my bioethics classroom, I've often noted that it's sort of status quo preserving. Is this politically progressive, or is it going to sort of maintain the current circumstances? And so I would just say that I'm going to have to keep thinking about your question, and I really appreciate it.
Okay, our next question is from August Gorman. They ask, this is such an important project. Thanks for the talk. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what tools collectivist approaches to risk might have for interacting with people who have very high risk aversion. I'm thinking in particular about how people with health anxiety might figure into these sorts of approaches.
Interesting. This reminds me of your talk, August. I mean, because there's that sense of like this sort of personal, relational, and I actually was talking to my own partner about some of the things that you said during your talk about how your sort of access concerns and things interact with the people in your immediate vicinity. I thought that was so helpful. And so I guess I want to say that in my mind, some of these political projects sort of open up new ways of being and interacting. So mutual aid societies and things like that create other spaces for recognition. So thinking about health anxiety specifically, I might very tentatively say something like, the clinic is the space in which the meanings of medicine and health get worked out, but in mutual aid collectives and in other spaces in which there's like a grassroots growth of sites for engagement with others, both politically and personally, you might get new like arenas for subjectivity in which you have new experience related to medicine or something like that. And I'm not saying that that's going to like quell or change. I guess what I mean is that hopefully shared political projects provide new space for engaging with each other immediately. So maybe that's in line at the food bank, and we come up with like really interesting ways of picking up food that's responsive to folks in a pandemic. And I think we've seen that, you know, refrigerators that are unplugged and sort of out on the street, you can walk by and get things all on your own, you know, out in Seattle and Portland and things like that. And you know, there's no sort of office to which you're going and applying and being in a crowd there or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting and an important question. Thank you.
Great. So we have another one. It looks like, I'm not sure if we'll have time for any more after this one, but at least this one from Michelle. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Michelle Curia, asks, your objection to the politics of nudges is very interesting. Could you say more about this? I'm thinking of Canada's decision to print graphic images of the adverse effects of smoking on cigarette packets, which could be considered a nudge. Do you think this sort of policy is problematic?
Yeah, I do actually, because I think that what it means is that you're going to like shame and name and encourage individual people to do something different, where obviously there are huge corporations. I mean, this might seem facile or something like that, but I mean, just to briefly say something, you know, there are huge corporations whose behavior can change in terms of like being taxed or regulated differently. You know, sin taxes are articulated against individual people. That becomes then your foolishness if you go on to smoke. And just, this is kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know if folks know about this sort of more, I think it's pretty well known that, you know, a lot of nurses smoke, and it's often because they only can go on a break. They can go on a break every hour if they smoke. Otherwise, they have to wait longer for their breaks. You know, that kind of thing. Like if we're talking about the politics of nudging as asking a hospital to have a different break policy, that would be fine. But that puts the onus of responsibility somewhere else. So I worry about the assumed, first of all, assumed asymmetry and nudging policies where there's like a scientific understanding that's correct and better and like more reasonable and more technical. And then there's like a layperson ignorance that they're trying to combat. I think that asymmetry that is assumed is really problematic. And then, or at least, politically complicated and needs to be uncovered more. I'm trying to be more expressive when I use the word problematic and actually say what's underlying that. And then secondly, I think that, you know, the nudging is, yeah, it's aimed toward individuals. Why? It's just responsibilization again, I think. And, you know, a lot of people with secondhand smoke effects and things like that are children. They're not the ones who are going to see the images on these cartons. You know, it's a little bit more complicated, but yeah. So thank you.
Okay, and this is probably our last question because we're just about at time. But Julie Maybe asks, thanks for the great presentation. The idea of risk discourses made me think of another discourse on risk that we hear about in the disability studies literature, namely, the idea of being able to take risks as one of the freedoms, and a good thing, that is often denied to disabled people. Would you be willing to comment on this kind of discourse? And this came up actually in my talk yesterday with
Yes,
the dignity
I
of
was just
risk.
going to
Yeah,
say, yeah, I was just
yeah.
going to say that. I took note, Joe, during your presentation when you talked about the dignity of risk. And I think that's exactly right. I'll just keep it very brief. I think this is exactly right. This goes to the venture capitalist risk subject. Okay. Some people are in our sort of risk landscapes, and I want to multiply all of this. I mean, it's not like homogenous, right? But some folks are praised for taking risks, but you have to be a certain kind of person. The venture capitalist that isn't like the white male is going to be told that they're foolishly investing, right? I mean, so you get like definitely, I think, permission to take risks. And this is just a whole other subjectification in my mind of what risk is all about. And so what I mean by that, I think, is that yeah, the dignity of risk that Joe was talking about, you do want, like, if you got that, it would be an indication that you had more power. And that is good. You need to, people should have, you know, we should reverse power relations. But the reason why that looks good, I think, is because of neoliberalism or our capitalist structures or something like that. It looks good because the people in power have that, you know, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't be allowed to, you know, take off down the street really, really fast on a skateboard or something like that. And like that's silly or something that feels amazing. Take off down the street on a rickety old skateboard, you know, let's see what happens. But I am saying that like this idea of the dignity of risk, I think, is coming from the fact that you do get this image of power in our culture that is connected to the sort of venture capitalist picture of what it, you know, to be like successful or something like that. And so this is just very broad stroke, but I think that it's super important. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I believe we're at time.
Okay, another absolutely fascinating session. Thank you, Melinda, and thank you, Joe, for chairing so well. And thank you for all the questions. I know we had more that we couldn't ask. I know that because I have some myself. It's yet another area where I see connections with so many different areas that could all join together. So thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Joe. I will give you our customary small applause from one person, but we see people in the chat. All right, so we're going to close the formal conference quite soon. There are instructions about joining the break group, but before you do that, before you click on anything, Shelley and I both want to say some words. Shelley, do you want to go first, or shall I carry on talking?
Well, I wanted to thank the people at your school who did a tremendous job helping us with the tech throughout the conference. I've had a number of people say to me on Facebook and Twitter that you know, that this has been the most seamless you know, and flawless conference in terms of a Zoom presentation. So I want to thank them. I also want to thank all of the presenters and chairs. It's been, for me, it's been an absolutely breathtaking 3 days. I've learned so much. It's been so thought-provoking, and I'm just so appreciative. So thank you. I think that this conference has pushed the limits on how philosophy of disability has been done and represented and conceptualized. And I'm very proud of everyone. And I want to thank you, Jonathan, for being such a great co-organizer. And I'll let you finish up.
Okay, so it's an amazing job being a co-organizer with Shelley, because Shelley comes up with all of the ideas, and the organization went like this. Shelley would send me a long email with suggestions. I would send short emails back saying, yeah, that's a good idea. or we can do that, or yes, I'm sure we can work that out. So we from the Blavatnik School provided the tech facilities. We've with Katie helping with the Q&A, with Jamie doing all of the work. He's been with us all 3 days, sorting out the Zoom links and the YouTube links and making sure everything ran smoothly. And amazingly, every presenter did arrive on time and gave their presentation on time, and all the chairs were here. Jamie was behind the scenes sending out links and emails and making sure that all worked. I'd also like to thank the captioners. I don't know the names of the captioners. I'm sure there's more than one of them, because it's the most incredible work to caption a conference like this. And the technical terms and the speed at some points, it's amazing to see this appearing in front of your eyes. So thank you so much to the captioning company. I should also thank the Alfred Langdecker Foundation, who have supported the research program that has paid for the expenses of this conference.